Two people apply for the same job. The first has 10 years of direct industry experience. The second has 2 years of experience and an MBA. The MBA candidate gets the offer. When the hiring manager is asked why, she says the MBA demonstrated commitment and capability. The experienced candidate was more capable. The hiring manager knew it. She hired the MBA anyway. And it only makes sense once you understand what an MBA is actually for. Business schools will tell you an MBA develops leadership, strategic thinking, financial literacy. Some of that is probably true. But the companies hiring MBA graduates don't let them near a real strategic decision for at least 2 years after they arrive. They put them in rotational programs. They give them decks to build and frameworks to apply. The skills, whatever was learned in the classroom, are not the point. So why does the credential keep working? In 1973, an economist named Michael Spence asked exactly that question. His answer won him a Nobel Prize 30 years later. He called it signaling theory. And once you understand the mechanism, you'll find it operating in places that have nothing to do with a university campus. Start with the problem Spence was trying to solve. An employer wants to hire a productive employee. A candidate wants to be hired. The problem is the employer cannot see how productive a candidate actually is before hiring them. They can read a CV. They can run interviews. But interviews are performances. CVs are self-reported. Economists call this information asymmetry. One party in a transaction knows more than the other. In the labor market, the candidate always knows more about their own ability than the employer does. This creates a game. The candidate needs to somehow communicate their quality to an employer who has no reliable way to verify it. Words don't work. Anyone can claim to be talented. References don't work reliably. Nobody lists a reference who'll say something damaging. So what does work? By the time Spence wrote his paper, employers had already figured out a practical answer, even if they couldn't name the theory behind it. They looked for credentials. A degree from a selective university. A qualification with a difficult entry standard. An MBA. Not because of what these things taught. Because of what they cost. This is the part Spence formalized. A signal only works if it is expensive to fake. Think about it this way. If anyone could get an MBA in a weekend for $50, it would tell an employer nothing. Every candidate would have one. It would carry zero information. The signal works precisely because it is hard to obtain. 2 years of your life. Tuition that runs from $60,000 to over $100,000 at a mid-tier school like Indiana University's Kelley School of Business, depending on where you're from. The opportunity cost of not working during that period. For a low-ability candidate, that cost might simply not be worth it. The maths doesn't work. The future salary premium doesn't justify the upfront investment. But for a high-ability candidate, someone confident they'll outperform once hired, the long-term return justifies the cost. Spence called this a separating equilibrium. High-ability candidates get the MBA. Low-ability candidates don't. Employers learn to read the signal correctly. And here is the part that should stop you for a second. The MBA doesn't need to teach anything useful for this to work. The signal functions entirely through its cost. A useless but expensive degree can be a perfectly efficient signal. A useful but cheap degree signals almost nothing. This is counterintuitive enough that it is worth sitting with. The value of the credential is not in the content. It is in the barrier. The barrier is what makes it legible. The barrier is what makes it trustworthy. Remove the barrier, make the degree cheaper, easier, faster, and you don't make the signal more accessible. You destroy it. Education is just where Spence started. The same mechanism runs through an enormous range of economic behavior. Luxury goods. A Rolex tells time no better than a $20 watch. But a Rolex costs $10,000 or more. That cost is the signal. It communicates, to anyone in the room who can read it, that the wearer has resources, and chose to make that visible. A cheap watch communicates nothing, because anyone can afford one. The signal fails the moment it becomes accessible. The same logic explains why law firms spend heavily on their offices. A firm that can afford marble floors and a premium address is signaling financial stability and client confidence. A firm in a cheap office is signaling something else, even if the legal advice is identical. Clients are not stupid. They're just working with incomplete information. And costly signals are how they fill the gap. Political campaigns run on the same mechanism. U.S. Senate candidates spent a combined $1.64 billion on advertising in the 2024 election cycle. The spending itself is partly the point. A candidate who can raise and deploy that much money is signaling broad coalition support, which is precisely what an undecided voter is trying to assess when they have no other way to measure it. Now consider something closer to home. Unpaid internships. Every year, graduates from well-off families spend 3 to 6 months working for free at prestigious firms. The intern is not being paid. That is the point. Only someone with financial backing, a family safety net, savings, a subsidized living situation, can afford to work for nothing. The willingness to go unpaid is itself a costly signal. It communicates financial stability, long-term thinking, and access to networks that got them in the door. A candidate who needs to earn immediately cannot send that signal. And employers, consciously or not, have learned to read it. The pattern is consistent across all of these. Wherever there is information asymmetry, costly signals emerge to fill it. Every time. Here is what this means. Every time you are in a market where one party cannot verify the quality of another, hiring, being hired, buying, selling, signaling is already operating. The question is whether you are reading it correctly. The MBA candidate who got the job was not necessarily more talented. They were more legible to a system that cannot measure talent directly. That is not a flaw. It is the system working exactly as designed, because the alternative, taking everyone's word for their own ability, produces worse outcomes on average. Knowing this does not tell you to go get an MBA. It tells you to ask, for any expensive signal you are considering, whether the cost functions as a genuine barrier. One that a less capable, less committed person would rationally not clear. If it does, the signal has value. If it doesn't, if the thing is expensive but accessible to almost anyone, you are paying for noise. And somewhere, an employer is reading it as noise too. Remember those two candidates at the start. The experienced one probably was more capable. The hiring manager probably knew it. She hired the MBA anyway, because in a world where she cannot verify capability directly, the costly signal is the most reliable proxy available to her. That is not irrational. That is the game. And now you know you're playing it. If you want to keep seeing the mechanisms behind how the world actually works, subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from. And share this with someone who thinks their MBA was about the education.